This is the form that I get the most questions about, because not only are the instructions to this form difficult to understand, but also there are parts of the form that are difficult to fill out because the form is glitchy. So I will show you exactly what I do in order to be able to fill out this form. So first, go to USCIS and search for the form. Click on this link, the PDF download of this form, and the form will be opened in your internet browser. Do not type anything in this form and click the download button. Download it to your computer. Once it's downloaded, go to the folder where you saved it, right-click on it, and open with Adobe Acrobat Reader for desktop. This will not work if you're using a tablet or your phone or an internet browser. You must use this program to fill out this application. And by the way, I do not have a premium subscription to Adobe. This is just a free version. And as you will see in this guide, you will have no problem calculating the household size. In the beginning of this form, we will talk about how to fill out this form. And at the end of this form, we will talk about the required list of evidence. Expiration date for current affidavit of support is 1/31/2026, but also make sure that you always double check the edition date at the bottom of the page as well. So we are going to skip this top part because this is for USCIS and attorney use only, and we're going to start right here. So first, type in the petitioner's name. Keep in mind that the petitioner must fill out the affidavit of support even if they don't make any income. It is a requirement. So even if you're planning to use a household member or a joint sponsor, you still have to fill out this form. Next, we're going to select option 1A, I am the petitioner. The following options, 1B, 1C, are not really that important and are not used in majority of cases. In most situations, you will either select I am the petitioner, option 1A, or I am the only joint sponsor, option 1D. The rest of the options are extremely rare. So if you are the petitioning sponsor, you are, like we said, required to file the form I-864 no matter what. So you will always fill out 1 as a petitioner, option 1A. And if you have a joint sponsor, they will then have to fill out the form I-864 and select the option 1D. Keep in mind that the petitioner must fill out a separate affidavit of support for each relative who has a separate I-130 petition, and the same applies to a joint sponsor. I often see petitioners make the following mistake when they have a joint sponsor for their case. They will select that I am the first sponsor, and then they will have their joint sponsor select I am the second joint sponsor. That is wrong. The petitioner must fill out the form as a petitioner, and if they have a joint sponsor, they can only technically have 1 joint sponsor. You're only allowed to have 2 joint sponsors if you're sponsoring a large family under the same I-130 petition. But again, those cases are extremely rare. And if you are the kind of petitioner who is asking their spouse to help you financially sponsor somebody, your spouse is not considered a joint sponsor, so make sure that your spouse is not filling out this form. If you're still confused which form your co-sponsor must submit, I will link a video that you can check out below, which clarifies what form is required for what kind of sponsor. And then options like 1E and 1F are also extremely rare. Once you've provided your name, part 2 is the information about principal immigrant. So make sure that here you're not filling out the information of the petitioning sponsor. This part 2, is all about the person whom you are sponsoring. Type in their name and their mailing address. If the person whom you're sponsoring is outside the US, this is going to be their current mailing address as it is outside the US. And if you have trouble typing in a foreign address here, you can do it after printing the form, because you're going to have to sign this form in pen anyway and scan it back if you're, say, for example, submitting it to the NVC. So if the address doesn't fit in here, you can use a black pen to neatly write it in here. You do not have to write anything in the in care of name line if this person resides and receives mail at this mailing address. If this person doesn't receive mail at this mailing address and they have somebody else picking up mail on their behalf, then you can write that other person's name here. But in majority of cases, you will most likely leave this blank. Moving on. Provide the country of citizenship or nationality for your beneficiary, their date of birth, and alien number if they have one. If your beneficiary is overseas, it is likely that they do not yet have an A number. You can leave it blank. You're not required to write not applicable in the lines that don't apply to you. You can simply leave them blank. Same applies to USCIS Online account number. If your beneficiary is not in the United States and has never completed any online USCIS applications, they probably don't have an online account number. Next, provide their phone number, and you will notice that this form will only allow you to type in American phone numbers. So what you can do, once again, is print this form and then use a pen to type in the phone number later. Moving on. So in part 3, you are going to write the information about immigrants you are sponsoring. So most often you will answer yes to question 1 because you are sponsoring the principal immigrant, so this beneficiary right here that we listed in part 2. It is very rare that you will answer no to this question. This applies to situations when there is more than one joint sponsors for one large family. And this option is only for the second joint sponsor. So as the petitioner, you will always select yes. And if you are a joint sponsor, you will also always select yes. Now, a lot of sponsors get confused if they should be selecting questions 2 and 3 and writing the names of other family members for whom they have petitioned. When you file a separate I-130 petition for your beneficiaries, you will not be writing the other people that you are sponsoring on other petitions here. For example, if you are a U.S. citizen petitioner who submitted 2 I-130 petitions, one for your mom and one for your dad, you're going to fill out 2 separate affidavits of support and only include one of each parents in part 2. On one of the affidavits, you will write your mom's information here. And then on the other affidavit, you will write all your dad's information here. And you are not going to write the other parent's information here. Right here, it says, do not include any relative listed on a separate visa petition. So this is only for family members of this beneficiary that are included on the same I-130 petition. For example, you are a permanent resident petitioning your spouse and your child. Because you filed one I-130 petition for both of them, you're going to write your spouse's name here. And because your spouse's child is their derivative on the same petition, in that case, you will check off box number 2 and write that derivative child's name under family member 1. You would also do the same if, for example, you are a U.S. citizen who petitioned your fiance under the K1 category, and your fiance has a child with the K2 category who came to the United States under the same I-129F petition. In that case, you will include that K2 child's name in the family members section. But for our case, we are only sponsoring this person, and even if we have additional petitions for other relatives, we are not going to write their names here. Moving on to the next part. In question 29, you will be asked to sum up the total number of immigrants you are sponsoring on this affidavit, which means in this specific form. It doesn't ask how many people you're sponsoring ever. It's asking in this form how many people you're sponsoring. And you're going to sum up people that you listed in part 2 and part 3. Because we only have one person in part 2 and nobody else in part 3, we're going to write number 1 here. Moving on. Provide the information of the sponsor. Their full name and mailing address. Again, if the petitioner is able to receive mail at this address, we can leave this line blank and answer if it's the same as physical address. So basically it's asking if where you receive mail is the same place where you live. If that is, then we answer yes. However, if your mailing address is, for example, a PO box, you will answer no and provide your actual physical address where you reside here. But if these two are the same address, select yes and simply leave this whole section blank. Next, provide your country of domicile. In majority of cases, it will probably be USA. You can check out the domicile requirements on the Department of State's website that I will also link below. But in majority of cases, your domicile should be USA. Date of birth, city and town of birth, and country of birth, and social security number. Next, provide what kind of citizenship or residency status you have. If you are a permanent resident or a naturalized citizen, you should still provide your A number. And if you have a USCIS online account number. And the last question on this page asks if you are currently on active duty. And this is only to be completed by petitioning sponsors because the petitioning sponsors who are on active duty have lesser income requirements for the purposes of affidavit of support, which you can review on the I-864P page. Moving on to the next page, the household size. Like I showed you earlier, the way I downloaded and opened this form, it automatically calculates the household size for me. Any number that you typed in question 29 on this prior page will automatically calculate for you here. If you have any questions about how to properly calculate your household size, I will link 2 videos below that go in much more detail and give specific examples for various situations on how to calculate your household size. One of those videos also specifically talks about which children need to be counted in your household size. So if you're confused about counting certain children, I suggest that you watch that video. Petitioners who are sponsoring their spouse are listing their spouse's name in part 2 because their spouse is the beneficiary. Need to keep in mind that that spouse is already counted right here in item number 1. So the third question that asks if you are currently married and input your spouse, you will not count them here. You will simply leave this blank. And the form directions will tell you that you should not count anybody more than once. If you have any dependent children, type them in here. And I do recommend that you watch that video that I just talked about, because you must count all underage children, even if you don't claim them on your tax returns, even if they do not reside with you. If you have any other dependents in your tax returns, if you have anybody else listed aside from your children as your dependent, any like adults or other family members, you can put them here. If you have previously sponsored anybody using this form, you can count these people here, but only if they are now lawful permanent residents. But don't count anybody who is not yet a permanent resident. So for example, if you're filling out 2 affidavits of support, one for mom, one for dad, you will not count the other person that you are sponsoring on a separate affidavit here because they're not yet a permanent resident. And question number 7 asks if you have any household members who will be helping you with income requirements and who will be filling out the form I-864A, you can count them here. Because according to the form instructions, sponsors are not required to count their siblings, for example, or their parents or any adult children who live with them. You don't have to count them for the purposes of this affidavit. But if your income as the petitioner, for example, is not quite enough to sponsor, and if you have somebody living with you who is willing to add their income to yours, you can count them here. But again, any of these relatives that live with you, you don't have to count them if they're not willing to add their income to yours. And that is optional. They absolutely don't have to do this. Moving on to part 6, providing the sponsor's employment and income. So you can either say that you are employed, self-employed, retired, unemployed. You can select this and fill out your employment information. If you have an additional employer, you can type that here. And if you have 3 jobs, for example, then you can also write that 3rd job on the last page, the additional information page, if it doesn't fit. If you are self-employed, so for example, if you have a business or if you are an independent contractor, for example, an Uber driver, you can select self-employed. So then in question 7, you will be asked to provide your current individual annual income. So only your individual annual income. Here you will only write an estimate for the year in which you're filling out this affidavit. So for example, if you're filling out this form in 2024, this is going to be your annual income estimate between January and December 2024. This doesn't have to be exact, only an estimate. If you are the kind of petitioner that doesn't have any income, for example, you are a person who is sponsoring your parents, but you are a stay-at-home wife or you're currently unemployed, then you will select unemployed and write your income as 0 if you're making nothing at all. So this is individual. This does not include anyone else's income, only yours. And if you are typing a question right now, but what if I am filing taxes jointly with my spouse? We will get to that. But here you will only write your individual income. Moving on. These following questions will ask if you are using income from anybody else in your household, then you will type in their name and income here. So this over here is asking if any of these people we just counted here will be contributing their income. If you are the kind of petitioner who's petitioning his mom or dad, and you're also married, and if your spouse agrees to also combine their income with yours, you can write your spouse's name here. Or, like we mentioned here in question number 7, if you have anyone else residing with you who is adding their income to yours, remember, they don't have to. This is optional. You can also write their name here. You can say, for example, their name, that they're your brother or sister, for example, and they must be residing with you, and input their income here. I often see the following mistake. When you have household members who make 0 income, you do not write them here. Do not make this mistake. This is a huge mistake that causes a lot of issues for people because they will request evidence of this, even if you say they make zero income. So anyone who is living with you who makes zero, you do not add them here. This is only for people who are adding their income to yours. If, for example, your beneficiary is living in the United States and working in the United States with authorization, you can put their name down here as well and include their income as well. If your beneficiary is residing overseas, you will not put their name here because they do not consider foreign income. So for example, if Jane is the spouse who's also applying for, let's say, adjustment of status, and maybe she's here on the kind of visa that allows her to work legally in the United States, you can use her income in this section. If Jane is not authorized to work, then even if she's been living in the United States for a long time, because she worked without authorization, also do not include her income here. So moving on, question number 20 asks you to sum up all the incomes that we have listed on the prior page. Our annual estimate is about $50,000, and that is exactly the number that the form will auto-populate for us. And like I said earlier, if you write anybody else here, let's say we included somebody, as you can see, when you use Adobe, if you write someone else's income in this line, it will now automatically sum it up on this page. But because we don't have anybody else, we'll leave this blank. Moving on to question 21, you will only answer this question if the people who you have listed on this page under person 1, 2, 3, or 4, if they are required to fill out the form I-864A, you will check this box. And if you did not list anybody on this page, you will simply leave this question unchecked. And finally, question 22 will say that anybody who is listed over here, once again referring to the prior page, is not required to fill out the form I-864A because they are an intending immigrant. So if you read the form instructions, you will see that anyone who lives in your household must fill out and sign this additional form if they are contributing their income, except if the person who is helping you with income is the actual beneficiary who is immigrating. So let's say, for example, Jane, she's working here legally, she's adding her income to yours. We will check box 22 and write her name here. So even though she's adding her income, she doesn't need to fill out an additional form. But let's say, for example, you are petitioning your mom or your dad, you file your taxes jointly with your spouse, and maybe your spouse is also adding her income. In that case, because your spouse is not an immigrant, she will have to fill out the form I-864A. If this section on your affidavit of support is blank, then you will leave both of these questions equally blank. You need to be reading very carefully what these questions are asking for. Moving on, the federal income tax return information. So first, it asks if you have filed federal income tax return for each of the most 3 recent tax years. So for example, if you're filling out this form in 2024, it is asking if you have filed tax returns for 2023, 2022, and 2021. If you have, you will answer yes to this question. And if you have not filed for 1 or 2 or all 3 of those years, you will answer no. Even if you filed your taxes jointly with your spouse, you are considered to have filed your tax returns even if your spouse did that, because you are included on a joint tax return. So you will answer yes to this question. Please pay attention to this note that you must attach a photocopy of transcript or federal tax return for only the most recent tax year. So if you're filling out this in 2024, you will have to provide the tax returns for 2023. The other 2 years are optional. But if you strongly believe that your income from years 2022 and 2021, for example, are also a good indicator of your sponsorship, then you can attach them as well. And then if you are sending additional tax returns from other years, you will select this box. But again, you're not required to do so. Moving on. In questions 24A, B, and C, you are asked to provide the information from your tax returns for the most recent 3 years from the total income line, not AGI. Under this video, I will link another video I made that explains in detail why you must write total income and not AGI. I often get this comment, but it says to write AGI. No, it doesn't. It says only write AGI if you are using the Form 1040EZ. This Form 1040EZ no longer exists. So you will not be writing AGI. You will only be writing total income. If you have not yet filed the tax returns for 2023, you must do so before you submit this affidavit of support. Even if you have an extension, USCIS, DHS, they don't accept tax extensions. All late taxes must be filed before you file this form. Even if you're planning to use a joint sponsor, the petitioning sponsor must file 2023 taxes. You will write the exact number that is listed on the total income line on your tax return. I also often get a question, what if I file my taxes jointly with my spouse? Right here, do I only write the amount that I personally make or whatever is written on tax returns? So the answer is you must write exactly what is listed in your tax returns, even if you file jointly with your spouse. Even if you did not include your spouse's income on the prior page, you still in this section must write the total income exactly as listed in your tax returns. And if you are wondering how USCIS is going to figure out which part of the income is yours, you can check out the evidence section at the end of this tutorial. If, for example, you did not file taxes, let's say you were not required to file taxes, maybe you were unemployed during this time, and you only have 1 year worth of taxes to show, you may also want to consider providing proof of your current income in the form of an employment verification letter or your pay stubs. So let's say in our case, we will provide tax returns for all 3 years to increase our chances of getting accepted. And if for the most recent tax year 2023, you didn't file not because you were late, but because you were not required to file, you will check this box. I was not required to file. And on the last page, you will explain why you didn't file. So page 5, part 6, question 25, and you can write, I was not required to file tax returns for 2023 because I was a full-time student. See attached school transcript and IRS report of non-filer status. So if you didn't file, for example, that you were a student, or you could say I was unemployed, you will attach evidence of that as they ask. So for example, it could be your school transcript to show that you weren't required to file, or it could be that you simply were unemployed. In that case, you can provide them with an IRS transcript, which you can obtain through your online IRS account, that will show that you didn't file taxes for that specific year. So it doesn't show proof of why you were not required to file, but it will show them that you didn't file for that year. We obviously filed tax returns for the most recent year, so we don't have to check off this box. Moving on to part 7, use of assets. It is absolutely optional. So assets are only required if the income you have listed here is not enough according to the poverty guidelines. From the form instructions, you can see that assets can be used to supplement that income, but your assets must be fully owned or have significant equity on them, and those assets must have a value that equals 3 or 5 times, depending on your situation, the difference. So let's say, for example, you are $2,000 short on your income requirement and you're petitioning your spouse, for example. You want to have at least $6,000 of assets to supplement that income. So it can either be a savings or a checking account, real estate, for example. It can be stocks, a value of your second vehicle. If you are meeting the income requirement here, you can totally skip this entire part. And if you are using a joint sponsor, you also do not need to write your assets, because once you have a joint sponsor, your income as a petitioner is irrelevant, and so are your assets. If you do choose to add assets to your form, you will need to provide proof of those assets. Not only are you going to have to provide proof of how you have obtained those assets, but also their current value, their current market value. If you are including, for example, savings and checking account assets, you will need to include 12 months worth of statements from those accounts to show that you've had those assets. For real estate, you will need to get not only a new appraisal for that kind of asset, but you will also need to provide mortgage statements to show how much of that mortgage you have paid off. Like it says here, current assessed value minus the mortgage debt you have, for example. So it is a big headache with assets, so you can't just list them here. You're going to have to also provide proof of those assets. If you have any other relatives that we listed on this part of the form, you can list their assets in here. And if your immigrating relative is also adding assets, you can add their assets here. If your immigrating relative has assets overseas, not only are you going to have to provide all the proof that we talked about here, you're also going to have to provide the exchange value for those assets and translations of all documents. Make sure that you properly sum them up on this page. And once you're done with the assets piece of it, move on to part 8. Read the contract and the responsibilities of the person who is signing this affidavit of support, and your obligations for this affidavit of support will only end in one of the following scenarios. You will notice here that divorce is not one of these options. So if you sponsored your spouse who is now a permanent resident and you got a divorce, you're still responsible to be a sponsor for that spouse until one of these scenarios occurs. All right, so next, select one of these if you read and understand English yourself, or if somebody interpreted or prepared this form for you. Provide your contact information here, and on the next page, you will need to sign and date. This signature must be made in pen. USCIS, nor DHS, nor NVC will accept electronic or digital signatures. So what you're going to have to do is print out this form, sign this form, and scan it back if you're submitting it to the NVC, or Again, if you're sending it with adjustment of status, print this form and sign it in pen. If you used an interpreter that we listed over here, you will provide their information in Part 9. And if you used a preparer who filled out this form for you, you will provide their information in Part 10. If you did not use an interpreter or preparer, you can leave these boxes blank. And finally, the additional information page is used to clarify any information that you would like to clarify on the prior page. And even if you have no additional information to provide, you still must fill out your name, so the sponsor's name, and alien number if applicable. You must still include this page with the rest of your application because they require that every page of the application is submitted, even if it is left blank. So now let's talk about the list of evidence that is required for this form. You can also see a checklist of required evidence on the last page of the Form I-864 instructions. Every sponsor, no matter if it is the petitioner or a joint sponsor, must submit proof of their U.S. status, which means a copy of their U.S. passport, U.S. birth certificate, naturalization certificate, or a copy of their green card. Every sponsor must provide tax returns from the most recent tax year. It is best to include tax return transcripts, which you can download from the IRS online account, rather than the tax return IRS Form 1040. But if the Form 1040 is all you have, that is also perfectly acceptable. You should be providing copies of your W-2s or 1099s. Additional optional evidence includes an employment verification letter, which is a letter you can get from your HR department that will state how much money you make per year, per hour, how many hours you work, and what position you hold, and when you were hired. Another optional piece of evidence includes pay stubs from the past 6 months. And if you listed any household members in your affidavit of support, you will also need to provide not only proof of their status and their tax returns, as well as their proof of relationship to you. And finally, if you are a sponsor who owns a business or is self-employed, the list of required evidence for you is a lot longer. I will link a very useful resource, not from me, but from a law firm that discusses exactly what kind of evidence needs to be provided if you own a business.